from the City of Presidents. It's the All About Quincy podcast. This is your host, John Melley. Join me as we explore the history, hidden gems, and highlight the businesses with great stories that all tell the tale why Quincy, Massachusetts is a great place to live. Hey there, it's John. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I do appreciate it, and welcome to episode 4 of the All About Quincy podcast. I have a true confession. I totally spaced on this episode. I had recorded this back at the end of June with Alexandra Elliott and Ed Fitzgerald, both from the Quincy Historical Society. And you ever have a project that you start and you get distracted and then you forget all about it, and then you suddenly have that jolting feeling, you sit upright and that adrenaline dump, and you go, oh my gosh, I forgot all about that. And then you forget about it again. And then you realize you've blown it twice. And then you get embarrassed. So you procrastinate on it. Yeah, that's what I did with this episode. Alexandra Elliott and I started corresponding, I think back in May, to get this episode recorded. And we recorded it back at the end of June. And so it's been a couple of months that this interview with the kind folks at the Quincy Historical Society has been sitting, waiting to be published. And so my public apology to Ed Fitzgerald and Alexandra Elliott at the Quincy Historical Society for kind of messing this up. I hope you'll forgive me. I hope you'll enjoy it. And if you've got any comments or feedback, please go to allaboutquincypodcast.com and let me know your thoughts. Now, without any further delay, let's listen to my conversation with Ed and Alexandra. Well, as I said at the beginning of the program, I have some guests from the Quincy Historical Society, and I am very excited about today's show. My guests today are Edward Fitzgerald and Alexandra Elliott, and Edward is the executive director, and Alexandra is the curator for the Quincy Historical Society. And you folks have been very busy reopening after the COVID pandemic, and we worked hard to get this episode scheduled. So I want to thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me today.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I was thinking that the Quincy Historical Society, of all the historical societies in the country, has got to be one of the primo historical societies to be a part of.
We certainly think so. Quincy is very unique in that it just has such a tremendous width and breadth of topics that you can talk about in terms of the history of the city, back all the way to the Revolutionary period and before that. And then all the way up through World War II and to today as well.
Edward, how did you get started with the society?
I kind of fell into it, I suppose, is the answer. I had an academic background. I had done some teaching and some freelance editorial work and writing and things like that, and worked in nonprofits and had family ties to Quincy. And okay. We were back here, and the timing just turned out to be right. And they were looking for somebody, and I was looking for something along these lines, and it happened. And I was happy because I was interested in the topic, and it's been very interesting. It's been a good thing to be doing.
Alexandra, how about yourself?
I kind of fell into it a little bit too. I got started back in 2017. I was brought on to help out with a Howard Johnson special exhibit that was going up.
Oh, cool.
And then Ed decided that we worked well together, and so brought me on a more permanent basis, and I've been here ever since, and it's been great. There's never a dull moment, honestly.
Right, especially the last year and a half, right?
That is true, yeah.
Tell me about the history of the Historical Society. You sent over some information before this conversation, and I don't know how it fits into the scheme of how old relative historical societies are in the country, but it was founded in 1893 by some pretty prominent folks. If you tell us about that.
Yeah, it's not by any stretch one of the oldest societies. There are some real granddaddy old societies like the New York Historical Society and Massachusetts Historical Society, that both of which have more than a century on us.
Wow.
But there was a big movement in kind of historical recognition and historical concern in the 1890s. And I think the society kind of comes out of that. And you're right. I mean, they had some very, very prominent people, including our first president, who was first president of the society, was Charles Francis Adams II, Charles Francis Adams Jr. And then his brother, Brooks Adams, was president of the society for 20 years in the early part of the 20th century. But then a lot of just community people came together to do it as well. It was it's interesting because it looks like it was a pretty democratic, small d democratic society all along. There was no you had to be invited to join or you had to prove your pedigree or anything like that. Anybody who was interested, they were more than happy to have joined right from the start. Mm-hmm. And the secretary and the treasurer and the president were all, guys to start with, but there were women in prominent roles really from the start too. So there's some very nice things about it. There's some good background there.
You said something at the beginning of the history of this thing. You said that there was a sense that it was important to create a historical society. What was the backdrop to that thinking?
I think it's several things. I think it's a period of great change, obviously, for America. And in many ways, Quincy had turned into a city to adopt a city form of government 5 years earlier in 1888. Our population wasn't huge, but it was kind of clear we were becoming a city. And with that, all sorts of changes were going to take place. Also, to be quite frank, immigration and the changing demographics of the town, I think, made people, particularly people who were of the old Yankee stock, the people like Charles Francis Adams, interested in preserving the history of their time. So a lot of the impulse, I think, was to preserve the history of their time, but they didn't get stuck in that. I mean, and there were also, by 1893, the major ethnic group, other than English, Anglo-Saxon Protestant people, would have been the Irish. And there were Irish people in fairly important positions in the society from the start, too. But it's a kind of combined push-pull in a way that there's a kind of fear of things are changing and oh my God, we've got to save things, which is maybe not the best motive. But there's also the motive of we've got to save what is best for the future, which is the good motive, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you described is understandable. And I think we're going through a similar time now in our history. Yeah. So I can see that. What is the Quincy Historical Society's mission?
It is to preserve as much of Quincy history as possible, and that being, what is happening in recent years, and then also going back as far as, Quincy would exist. We have, first of all, our museum. Currently, we're in the Adams Academy building, our beautiful building here on Adams Street. And we have a museum that spans from the earliest days before you had European settlement, so dealing with some of the Native American history, but then going up through the 20th century as well. And so that's a lot of ground to cover in a fairly small space.
You had sent over a picture of the Historical Society's building, and it looks a lot like the Thomas Crane Public Library. Was it designed by the same architect?
It's not the same architect, but it is the same, or it's a similar architectural style.
Okay.
So our building is in the Gothic Revival style. It was done by, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, this is going to be William Ware and Henry Van Brunt, I think it is.
I think it's Henry. It's certainly Van Brunt.
So it's Ware and Van Brunt.
All right.
Who designed the building. And it's
for our purposes, we'll call him Hank.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But what's kind of interesting about the building is that usually you'll see the granite as the main building material, but instead our building uses it as the embellishment, as the trim, which is quite interesting because it's a very pretty building, but it's got the granite as the accent piece instead of the brick.
I wouldn't have observed that, but yeah, that's cool.
John Adams had specified in the deeds to create the school that this was, that it be built of Quincy stone, Quincy granite.
Okay.
The crane obviously is Henry Hobson Richardson, the great American architect. And this building is about 10 years earlier. This was opened in 1872, and the crane opened in 1882.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So tell me about some of the programs that the Historical Society run.
Typically, during a year, during a regular year, we would have usually monthly either guest speakers or special programming talking about a myriad of different topics. Our summer ones tend to be a little bit lighter fare. We have a fun pop culture series that we usually run during the summer, having to do with like a lot of music or other pop culture topics that are related to Quincy. During the pandemic, we've started transitioning to doing more virtual programs over Zoom and the like. And we had a couple really popular ones. Mm-hmm. We did a reprise of a 2019 program that we had that was featuring the experience of Quincy during the 1918 influenza pandemic.
Oh, okay.
Featuring some original research that we had done back then before we knew what was coming down the pike.
Right.
So of course, people were very interested to kind of see, okay, so how did Quincy deal with this in the past? And then we also did one about another disease, more death and disease, about yellow fever and how that influenced American culture. And then we did a much more lighthearted one about the various ad campaigns done by Howard Johnson over the years. Those were all very popular.
Yeah, that's very cool. It was always interesting to hear from my perspective, people talking about the COVID pandemic in terms of in these unprecedented times. And they weren't unprecedented. They're unprecedented in our lifetime, but obviously we've been through something like this before. But I wondered many times how we would have fared without the technology that we have available to us today. The restaurants they switched very quickly to takeout orders through various apps and delivery services, and a lot of people were able to work remotely.
Right.
And so I just wonder how everything would, I mean, you can only speculate, but you just wonder how different would it have been if we did not have the technology today that we have today.
It undoubtedly would have been much harder.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Those sounded like interesting things. I was telling Alexander and I had a call before this recording session, and my dad grew up in Milton, and my grandfather actually knew Howard Johnson. My grandfather was treasurer at the Milton Cooperative Savings Bank, I think. And actually, I'm looking at the date that the society was founded, and he was born in 1893, my grandfather. So it's interesting to hear some of these names in history, and there are some ties. Yeah, I don't know if I told you this, but if you're familiar with Milton and the Forbes Museum at all, my great-great-granduncle is Thomas Murdoch, or was Thomas Murdoch, who built the Lincoln replica cabin.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my grandmother, the woman who married my grandfather, who I was just discussing. Quinn, what are you doing, buddy? Get out of there. Hey, hold on. He's tearing a paper bag. That's Quinn the Jacoby. Okay.
There he is.
Big good boy.
He's always a way to handle it.
Yeah, well, he's the mascot for the podcast, so we'll have to post a picture.
Yeah.
At any rate, my grandmother was a Murdoch, and Thomas Murdoch was her uncle. He was hired by Forbes to build a replica, and he drove down there in a Model T and went and took measurements and took saplings, tree samples, and dirt samples so that he could match the color of the chinking between the logs in the cabin. So those were the things. But he was quite the character. My father said he got through many a school report writing stories about his Uncle Tom. He was crazy. When he had a cold, he would sip kerosene.
Oh my
God. He was gonna burn it out.
Okay.
Oh my Lord.
He
lived into his well into his 90s. I mean,
really?
Yeah, he really did.
Maybe there's something to it.
Yeah, maybe.
I wouldn't count on it.
I'm not sure I want to try it, but so it's kind of fun to hear all of this stuff and just know that my family has roots way back, and some of them actually knew some of these people that were discussing.
That's kind of one of my favorite parts of the job is whenever we do a program or post something on our blog or on our Facebook page, and you just get people commenting or coming up to us and telling us stories about their family and what they remember and what their family stories are. And that's always really interesting to see what people say.
Now, you do stuff with the schools as well, the Historical Society.
We do, yes.
Right. Yeah.
Tell us about it.
We have a program in the 3rd and 4th grade, and so we go into every class in the 3rd and 4th grade in the Quincy Public Schools and the Quincy Catholic Academy. We have a teacher. We have a certified retired Quincy Public School teacher, Susan Egan, who's doing a terrific job. So it's really, of the several things that we do, most of what we do, we're more or less proud of, justly, but the school program is really kind of our hallmark in a lot of ways. It's been going now for well over 3 decades. It's been going in one form or another, pretty much the same since the 1980s, and it is really important to the life of the community. Kids learn the basics about Quincy's history at a time when they can kind of absorb it, and you hear adults say, "Remember taking the course? I remember the coming here as a kid." So it's, I think, a very valuable thing that we do.
My wife is a 4th generation Quincy resident, and she went to elementary school at the Adams School. And she recalls fondly, she says, every year we would march on down the hill, down to the birthplaces and get the tour and all of that. The reason I moved to Quincy was because I got married to Ann. And as I said earlier in my conversation, my dad grew up in Milton. So we would come down to Milton to visit my grandparents. And I couldn't tell you how many times we drove off and got off on it wasn't the Bryant Ave exit, but the one prior to it, and came out into East Milton Square. And we drove by that brown sign on the highway that says, next exit, Adams Historical Site and National Historic Site or something. And I'd be, look at that. And then wasn't until I finally moved here, I said, wait a minute, this is so cool. There's so much here. I have to go see this.
Yeah.
And I hesitate to make this comment, but I wonder how many, it's like the tourist thing to do, but I wonder how many people, obviously, I think one of the good things about this school program is people who grow up here, it's not like they never do the Freedom Trail. You live in the Massachusetts area, you never do the Freedom Trail. This exposes kids at an early age to the history of where they're living. And I think that's great. It gets them there, gets them to see all of this.
It's a very good point. It does get them there. They get to go to the historic sites. They get to come here, and gives them a sense of who they are. It gives them an experience of a museum at an early age and everything else. So yeah, it's terrific, I think.
Yeah, along those lines as well, I'm not originally from Quincy. I'm from Dedham, which is, not too far away, but I didn't grow up in Quincy. But something that I've really been impressed by and have become very proud of is kind of, working here and have it been a sort of adopted community that I'm a part of.
Yeah.
Is just how much history there is and how relevant Quincy is to so many different stories within American history. I've started saying every once in a while, all roads lead to Quincy, just because of how many different parallels and tangents. And it's like, I'll be listening to something completely unrelated and, oh my gosh, that's related back to Quincy? How?
I think I developed a sense of appreciation for American. When I was a kid, I grew up in Metro West. Actually, when I was a kid, before I moved, I lived in Lexington. Obviously, we all know what happened there. And we would go and see, my mom grew up in Arlington, and we would go and see on Patriots Day the reenactment of Paul Revere's ride. And then if you got up really early, you could actually watch the battle on Lexington Green. So from an early age, I had always had this keen interest in the American Revolution. And I had to do a book report in school about Thomas Jefferson. And of course, he wrote the Declaration of Independence and all that, but he had a team of people that he worked with. But
Adams was one of them.
Yes, he was.
Of course.
And Benjamin Franklin, I think, was another one. And to me, it was always interesting. It always sort of was partial to Jefferson. And then I know there was some artistic license taken with it, and I have read the book by McCulloch as well. But I watched the Adams series on HBO and reading some of the other things, and you see some of the things that Thomas Jefferson was doing later on after John Adams was vice president and then became president, and the workings and the machinations of what he was doing, buying people to write stories in the newspapers and all of that kind of stuff. And you look at it and you go, it actually gives you some hope. If you can look at history from a long stand, you go, 'twas ever thus.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's really nothing new.
Yeah, no, people do not change. People still behave the same ways that they always have.
Of course, that was McCullough's experience himself. He had started out to do a book on Jefferson and Adams, with Adams as the sort of second banana.
Yeah.
And wound up being so caught up with Adams that he just jettisoned the entire Jefferson side of the project and did the full biography of Adams.
Well, I'm glad he did. I learned so much from that book, and I think, I've got a bias because of where I live now, but the writer of the Massachusetts state constitution and the U.S. Constitution, I mean, it's just really, and that he was so well read in all of these different philosophies, and a student of history and governments throughout history, and that they took and they analyzed what the failings were, and they said, what can we do to make that not happen, when they were trying to come up with what we have now. And I just think it's a remarkable accomplishment. And I just think it's really incredible that we're here. And I was talking with Tim Cahill, and one question I asked him, and I'll ask you the same. What do you think their reaction would be if they somehow materialized back today and they landed, on the front steps of the birthplaces, and they looked around and they saw McKay's and Sweeney's and and all that, but they saw that their homes were still there? How do you think they would react to Quincy today?
You're talking about Adams, the Adams.
Yeah. And not just John Adams, but Abigail, who was a huge influence on John Adams' career.
Yeah. Well, Adams believed very much in that kind of 18th century sense that history moved, that things were not static, that things were not eternal. So I don't think it would be surprised. I mean, he might say, what the heck is that thing going by as a car goes?
Yeah.
But I don't think he'd be surprised that things were wildly different. So I think, that would be okay. I mean, I think he would roll with the punches, I think. He would roll with the times. He was steadfast in a few things, and I think he would be surprised by a lot that happened. I think he still counted on a different kind of future for America than what actually took place. I think what actually took place is probably closer to what Hamilton thought. Mm-hmm. But I think he would accept that that's what happened, and I think he would be looking for the sort of core principles that he kind of held to, which were the classics of honor and representation and honesty, and he would probably judge today's politicians by those same standards that he would have used 200 years ago.
Yeah, probably, right. Jim said that he thinks he probably would have been proud in that kind of echoing what you said in terms that history and things move forward and change, but he probably would have been proud that they kept the homes. It's like, oh my gosh, they're still here. Tim Cahill said that John Adams sort of felt like history would forget him.
Right.
And that he would come back and see that those birthplaces in Peacefield and all those are still there. It's like, oh my gosh, they actually took the trouble to keep this. He told me that his job was to work at for the birthplaces and Peacefield. He was like a docent, a tour guide. Okay. Yeah, so he knows a lot about it.
Yeah, right. I mean, that would be the one thing that Adams might have been surprised about, is that they were still there, because he did say monument. I'm never going to have any monuments, or everybody else is going to get a monument, but not me. That kind of stuff.
Is there something about John and Abigail Adams and John Quincy Adams, and I feel terrible, I never remember. Is it Louisa?
Mm-hmm. Louisa, yes.
Louisa Catherine,
yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there something about them that we would be surprised to learn that you could share with us?
My favorite thing to say about that kind of is just how human they are.
Okay. How
they
so?
Are, you have instances of them being prideful, of them having spats with each other as a couple, but navigating the world in a way that is extremely recognizable to anyone else living today. They were no doubt remarkable people. That's not what I'm trying to say at all, that they weren't, but they were also, you read their diaries or their letters, and you're just seeing things that are, Abigail and John are having a spat over something and she's writing to a friend about it.
She left the cap off the toothpaste.
Right, exactly. And they're just, I personally really like it when someone who is as mythic as, the founding fathers can be, suddenly become, oh no, they could be my neighbor. Yeah. And they are very interesting for that reason.
I just saw, this is purely coincidence. By sheer luck, I was trying to check out something else earlier today, and I opened a book on Abigail and Louisa, Paul Nagel's Adam's Women. And this anecdote about Louisa, he was saying Louisa loved to read, apparently, and she would get so totally absorbed in the book that she would forget everything else, and she'd sometimes forget that they had to go out to a party or a ball or things like that. But one time, apparently, John Quincy was entertaining people at home. So you have all these guys sitting around, there's probably some big political meeting, or a dinner meeting that has political consequences. And Louisa has sort of set things up and gone upstairs to read. And they're having their brandy and cigars downstairs and talking over the great affairs of state. And it's getting darker and darker and darker. And Louisa's so wrapped up in the book that she forgets what time it is or that they're downstairs and that she doesn't come down to light the candles. And the guys, of course, are sitting there saying, well, we're not going to get up and light the candles. That's women's work. Eventually she realized it when she starts hearing something. And she comes downstairs, and all these guys, they're still not lighting the candles. They're just trying to walk around in the dark, and they're tripping over everything. And apparently, she said, I couldn't get over to light the candles because I was so busy laughing. That was just the most terrific thing I'd ever read about her.
Oh, that is funny. It's kind of like the modern day, the remote's under the seat cushion. If you just lift it up, you'd find it. Right. That's fun. Yeah, down to earth and human, I guess, is some of the interesting things that you see. Talk about being human and human frailties. You learn that Thomas Jefferson was massively in debt, and you have to say to yourself, you imagine what he would have been like if he had a credit card.
Oh gosh.
That was something that was such a contradiction in the perception, I guess, that I had of.
Yeah, surely they would be on top of their finances. That can't be.
Well, I guess he was constantly keeping a notebook of what the temperature was and the day, and the crops and when things came and all that kind of stuff. And I guess he kept a ledger of what he spent, but he just never managed to pay those things. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to share any upcoming events that you want to talk about that the Historical Society may be putting on, or if people want to learn more about the Historical Society and how they can get involved or perhaps donate and support it. Tell us, first of all, what you have upcoming, and then tell us about how people can get involved if they want to.
So I think the main thing that we have upcoming is that we are working on actually getting reopened.
Yes. Okay.
So the museum at this point is not quite open to visitors, but we are hoping by mid-July, we will be able to get our doors open to visitors again. So that's the main thing that we're preparing for.
Okay.
We also have a few blog articles coming up, a little bit about some of the Asian history in Quincy. Ed, I can't remember exactly what you're working on with Sacco and Vanzetti.
No. We're working on a couple of things. It's the 100th anniversary of the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which took place in Dedham. And people who aren't familiar with that, because it's dated a little bit, it was a very controversial case involving holdup and murder, and a very controversial trial and a very controversial execution of the two men, with all sorts of political overtones. And they were a kind of a cause for people at the time, and really for most of the years since then, really foundational to kind of a lot of people's feelings in the 20th century and even into this century. But there are Quincy connections to that all the way through because of where the crime took place in Braintree, where a lot of the people that were involved with it. So we're trying to tease out how Quincy played a role in that really kind of earth-shaking experience that really shook the Commonwealth at the time. There were massive demonstrations and at the time of the execution, everything else. So they were represented by two Quincy-based lawyers, as well as a more, I could go down the weeds in here. But
I didn't know that they were represented by Quincy attorneys. Yeah.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's all kind of, it weaves in and out. So I've just thought it would be interesting to kind of follow the strands of that to see not only what it tells us about the case, but also kind of what it tells us about Quincy 100 years ago. We're kind of interested in filling in that gap. We know a lot about the Adams generation. We know a lot really up to when we turned into a city, but we're kind of, or at least I'm kind of interested in working on what happened after we became a city, when we became more like the modern Quincy. What is there that we can find out about that we've not really aware of?
We can do that maybe in another episode down the road.
Yeah.
If people want to learn more about how to get involved with this if people want to learn more about how to get involved with the Quincy Historical Society, what's the best course of action for them to take?
So the best way to get in touch with us is purely to either call or email us. And if you're interested in getting involved or donating, etc., our email address is info@quincyhistory.org. And then if you're interested in seeing what we have coming up or what we are posting or researching about, we have 2 channels that are probably the best for that. And that would be, first of all, our blog, which is quincyhistory.org/blog. And then also you can find us on Facebook at Quincy History.
Awesome. quincyhistory.org.
Yes.
All right. Is there anything either of you want to share with us before we say goodbye?
Well, I've got one fun little anecdote kind of leading into the 4th of July.
Please.
Because this is one of my sort of fun facts about the Academy, and then also about one of the other famous founders from Quincy, having to do with John Hancock.
Okay.
The man, of course, whose very large signature is on that piece of paper that we will be celebrating on the 4th of July.
Right.
John Hancock was actually born on the property where the Adams Academy is located today.
Oh, I didn't know that. Huh.
The house burned down. I think it was in the 1760s. And
or just about then, 1758, I think, but
somewhere around there. That house burned down. But fun fact, in our collection, we actually have the front door key from that original parsonage in our collection. So that is on display.
Wow.
And that also explains why we have a bust of John Hancock in front of our building.
I just learned something, and hopefully the folks who listen to this episode will learn something as well. Ed, anything that you want to share before we say goodbye?
Going back to John, John was, if people want to go and look at the 4th of July and what John says about it, John actually thought maybe it would be July 2nd, not July 4th, but you can find in any of the books about him, his description of how we should celebrate July 4th is spot on. He wants fireworks. He wants the whole bit. And talking about him being able to see in the future, we did pretty good with that.
Yeah, I think I'd heard that. Well, I want to thank you both very much for taking time out of your busy schedule with the reopening and everything else that you have going on in your research and sharing all that you have with us today. And I want to say the door is always open. If you have any upcoming events that you want to share and talk about on the podcast, please reach out, and I hope to talk to you folks real soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you know someone who would be a great guest for the All About Quincy podcast, we want to know about it. Business leaders, historians, unsung heroes, just go to the website at allaboutquincypodcast.com. Fill out the contact form, tell us who you think would be a great guest and why, and we will try to make that happen. So until next week, thanks for listening.